That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, the image beneath the foil haunted me. The hollow, terrified eyes, the grotesque expression, the sharp blade pressed against the woman's arm. It made no sense. How could something so disturbing be hidden inside a toy meant for children? Around 2 a.m., I finally got up, unable to shake the unease that had settled deep in my chest. I walked into the kitchen and pulled the evil stick out of the drawer, staring at it under the dim light. It looked so innocent in my hands, just cheap plastic, pink and covered in sparkles, yet everything about it felt wrong. Then I pressed the button again. The same distorted laughter echoed through the kitchen, but this time it was different. It lasted longer. It dragged as if the sound file was corrupted. Then that eerie whispering returned, low, almost indecipherable. But this time, I understood one word: Emily. My blood ran cold. I dropped the wand onto the table, my breath quick and shallow. There was no way. I had to be imagining things. I pressed the button again. The sound had returned to the original unnatural laughter. No whisper, no name. But I knew what I had heard. The next morning, I told Sarah everything. She listened carefully, growing paler with each word. Finally, she exhaled and said, "We're getting rid of it." I agreed. I didn't want it in the house a second longer. But when I went to grab it from the drawer, it was gone. I felt my stomach drop. "Sarah," I called out, "did you move it?" She shook her head, her eyes widening. "Number, I haven't touched it." Panic settled in my chest. There were only two possibilities. Either I had somehow misplaced it, or I turned to look down the hall. Emily's door was slightly open. My heart pounded as I stepped inside her room. The morning light streamed in through the curtains, casting soft shadows across her bed. She was still asleep, her small figure curled up under the blanket. But there, clutched tightly in her little hands, was the evil stick. I nearly gasped. How had she found it? Slowly, carefully, I reached down and tried to ease it from her fingers. But the moment I touched it, Emily stirred, and then she giggled. It was a light, innocent sound. But when she turned to face me, my breath caught in my throat. Her eyes were still closed, but her lips moved, forming words in a slow, sleepy whisper. I leaned in closer, heart pounding, and I heard her say, "She's coming." I ripped the wand from her hands and staggered back, my mind screaming at me to get rid of it now. Without another word, I stormed out of the house. I didn't care about breakfast. I didn't care about the neighbors. I grabbed my keys, threw the evil stick into the trunk of my car, and drove. I didn't stop until I reached a field on the outskirts of town. There, in the middle of nowhere, I grabbed a can of lighter fluid from my trunk, doused the toy in it, and set it on fire. The flames curled around the plastic, melting it away in seconds. I watched as the cheap pink plastic deformed, the sparkles burning away in the heat. Then, just as the last embers flickered out, I heard it. A faint, distorted giggle carried on the wind. I never told Emily what happened. She doesn't remember anything about that morning, and I never asked. But sometimes, late at night, when I walk past her room, I swear I hear whispering. And every now and then, she giggles. That night, even after putting the wand away in the drawer, I couldn't sleep. Something about that toy was deeply wrong. The sound I had heard before, that muffled whisper, echoed in my head like a persistent murmur. I got up and went to the kitchen, determined to examine the toy more closely. I grabbed the wand and, with my phone in the other hand, started recording. I pressed the button once more. At first, the same metallic, distorted laughter came from the speaker, but then the noise changed. Now the sound seemed like a weak cry, followed by a creaking noise, as if something was being dragged. The red glow of the wand flickered slightly. My heart pounded. This wasn't a manufacturing defect. Someone had programmed these sounds. The image hidden behind the aluminum foil wouldn't leave my mind either. Who would choose such a horrifying picture for a children's toy? I decided to dig deeper. After a few minutes of searching, I found a dark forum where parents shared bizarre experiences with toys purchased from discount stores. Many mentioned the evil stick, and some had even found different images, all grotesque. But one comment in particular caught my attention. A user claimed to have taken the wand apart and found a modified audio chip. He said that when he connected the chip to a computer, he accessed audio files that shouldn't have been there, recordings of voices whispering incoherent phrases and strange noises. Panic started creeping in. I needed to know what else was hidden inside that toy. I grabbed a small screwdriver and began dismantling it. When I removed the back cover, I found something that made my blood run cold. Inside the wand, glued to the circuit board, was a small yellowed piece of paper with something handwritten on it. The ink looked faded, but I managed to read a few words. "Help me, he is here." I immediately dropped the wand. My stomach churned. Who could have put that there? Was it just a cruel prank, or something far more sinister? What scared me even more was the fact that reports about the toy were coming from various parts of the United States. It was as if someone somewhere was deliberately distributing these wands, hiding disturbing messages inside them. At that moment, I heard a noise coming from Emily's room. I ran there. She was sitting on the bed holding one of her other toys, but her eyes were fixed on the door. When I walked in, she whispered, "The man wants the toy back." My blood froze. "What man, Emily?" She pointed at the window. My heart raced. I rushed over and pulled back the curtain. The yard was empty, but something inside me told me we were not alone in that house. The next morning, I decided I needed to get rid of the wand. I grabbed the toy and threw it in the trash, but something told me that wouldn't be enough. I took the entire bag and dumped it in a dumpster far from home. When I got back, I found Sarah sitting in the living room, pale. "Did you see this?" she asked, pointing to the TV. On the news, a report was discussing a batch of toys being recalled from discount stores. The reason? Numerous complaints about disturbing images and unusual sounds hidden inside them. The report showed a photo of one of the evil stick wands, identical to the one I had bought. The anchor then mentioned that authorities were investigating the origin of the toys, but so far no company was officially registered as a manufacturer. It was as if the evil stick had appeared out of nowhere. I looked at Sarah and knew we had done the right thing by getting rid of the wand. But even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was behind all of this. That night, as I tried to sleep, I heard a sound outside the house, a metallic, distorted laugh. The same sound from the wand. And then, the whisper, "Help me, he is here." My name is Brian Keller, and to this day, I regret the moment I decided to browse Craigslist in search of a temporary job. At the time, I was unemployed, living alone in Columbus, Ohio, and the bills were piling up. Desperation forced me to consider any offer that seemed even remotely legitimate. It was on one of those nights while scrolling through the classifieds that I found a peculiar ad. Need a helper for household work, good pay, accommodation and meals included, light work, email for more information. The offer seemed perfect. I had nothing to lose, so I replied to the ad without thinking too much. A few hours later, I received a response from a man named James W., who said he needed someone to help him organize a rural property near the West Virginia border. He offered a high salary for simple work, cleaning some areas of the house, organizing old items, and helping with cooking. The email's tone was friendly yet formal. He explained that the property was remote in a quiet location, and that the job could last a few weeks. Besides the salary, I would have food and a comfortable room. My need for money blinded me to any possible red flags. Without hesitation, I accepted the offer. The next morning, James sent me an address and asked me to take a bus to a small town called Marietta. He would be waiting for me at the bus station. I grabbed my backpack, packed a few clothes, and left without telling anyone where I was going. The trip lasted about 5 hours. When I arrived, the place seemed even more remote than I had imagined. The bus station was little more than a shack with an old sign. There were only a few people around, and none of them seemed to be waiting for anyone. Then I saw a tall man wearing a brown leather jacket waving at me. He looked to be around 50 years old with graying hair and a wide smile. "Brian?" he asked, offering a firm handshake. "Yes, that's me," I replied. "Great. Hope the trip was smooth. Let's head home." We got into his truck and drove down the road. The surrounding landscape was desolate, filled with rolling hills and twisted trees. I tried making conversation, but James answered vaguely, avoiding questions about his family or his life before moving there. After about an hour on a dirt road, we arrived at an old house in the middle of nowhere. The place was large but run down, with boarded-up windows and a porch that creaked in the wind. "Welcome," he said, patting my shoulder. As soon as I stepped inside, I smelled something strong, meat cooking. The kitchen was spacious but messy, with sharp knives displayed on a wooden counter and a cauldron steaming on the stove. "Are you hungry?" James asked, smiling in an odd way. Something about it unsettled me. My instincts screamed that something was wrong, but I didn't want to appear rude. "Maybe later," I replied, trying to sound casual. He led me to my room upstairs. The room was small and windowless, containing only a wooden bed and an old wardrobe. When I closed the door, I noticed something strange. The lock was on the outside. My heart started pounding. Something was not right. I tried to calm my thoughts. Maybe it was just a mistake. Maybe James was eccentric, but harmless. But then, as I opened the wardrobe to put my things away, I saw something that made my stomach churn. There were blood-stained clothes hanging inside. My survival instinct finally kicked in. I needed to get out of there. My body froze when I saw the blood-stained clothes in the closet, emitting a strong metallic smell. My heart raced and my mind could only think of one thing: getting out of there immediately. I slowly closed the closet door, trying not to make a sound, and headed for the door, but it was locked. The pressure in my chest increased. James thought I was just another victim, and maybe I still had time. I heard footsteps approaching. I pretended to be relaxed, sitting on the bed. When James entered, he asked if everything was okay, and I lied. He led me to the dining room, where a table with old plates and lit candles was waiting for me. The smell of cooked meat was strong, and in the center of the table, a dish covered with a silver tray made me anxious. I forced myself to sit and look at the dish, but when the lid was removed, my stomach churned. What was there was not animal meat. I knew what it was. James, in a friendly tone, offered me the wine and dared me to try it. The glass had a strong smell of iron. While he talked about his life in the house, I searched for an exit. I looked at the kitchen door, which led to the back. If I could distract him, I could escape. But before I could react, he stared at me and said, "You know, don't you?" My body froze. He knew. James began to stand up, and in desperation, I threw the plate at him and ran toward the kitchen. When I tried to leave through the back, the door was locked. In a panic, I broke the window and jumped out. The pain in my arm was immediate, but I didn't stop. I ran as fast as I could, the dense forest ahead of me. I could hear James shouting behind me, but I kept running until I saw lights in the distance. A truck was approaching. I threw myself in the middle of the road, waving desperately. The driver slammed on the brakes and helped me into the vehicle. I was covered in blood and scratches, and I screamed for help. The police were called, and when they returned to James's house, he had disappeared. They only found a hidden basement, full of clothes, bones, and butcher tools. James was never found, but to this day, when I close my eyes, I see that sinister smile waiting for me to taste his food. Hello everyone on the channel. My name is Alex Carter, and I am fascinated by unsolved mysteries. A few years ago, one case left a deep mark on me, and to this day I can't forget it. The disappearance and death of Elisa Lam at the Cecil Hotel in Los Angeles. I am not the only one obsessed with this mystery. Many people have tried to explain what happened that night, but no one has found a definitive answer. Elisa Lam was a 21-year-old Canadian woman who decided to travel alone across the United States. During her stay in Los Angeles, she chose the Cecil Hotel as her accommodation, a place known for its dark history. Several murders and horrific crimes had occurred there, and the hotel had once served as a shelter for serial killers. For many, it was considered a cursed place. The last time Elisa was seen alive was on January 31st, 2013. When her family noticed she wasn't responding to messages, they reported her disappearance to the police. Days passed with no leads, However, 2 weeks later, the police released a video from the hotel's security cameras, and that's when everything became even more disturbing. The video showed Elisa inside an elevator acting strangely. She entered and exited the elevator repeatedly, pressed various buttons, and at certain moments it appeared as though she was hiding from something or someone. At one point in the video, she stepped into the hallway and gestured as if talking to an invisible presence. The elevator, which seemed to be malfunctioning, stood still with the doors open for an abnormally long time. The internet exploded with theories. Some said Elisa was fleeing from someone chasing her. Others believed she was under the influence of drugs or having a psychotic breakdown. But there were also those who thought something supernatural was happening. The search for Elisa continued for another 2 weeks until hotel guests began complaining about the water in their rooms. They said the water pressure was low and that it tasted and smelled strange. It was then that a hotel employee went up to the roof to check the water tanks. When opening one of them, he found something no one expected: Elisa Lam's body floating inside the water reservoir. The news shocked the world. How did she get there? The access door to the rooftop was locked, and only employees had the key. Additionally, the tanks were large and heavy, and the metal lid could hardly be lifted by a single person, especially a thin young woman like Elisa. The autopsy found no signs of illegal drugs or alcohol in her body, only the medications she took for depression and bipolar disorder. The official cause of death was accidental drowning, but this did not convince many people. If it was accidental, how did Elisa get into the tank? How did she manage to get up there without being seen? Why wasn't the elevator working properly in the video? Nothing made sense. Many people began to investigate the case on their own. Some claimed the elevator footage had been edited, that minutes were missing from the video, and that the police were hiding something. Others pointed out similarities between Elisa Lam's case and the film Dark Water, where a girl dies in the same way, inside a water tank in an old building. With each detail uncovered, more questions arose. Was Elisa fleeing from someone that night? Did she hear something that made her panic? And above all, did someone put her up there? Or was it something beyond our comprehension? To this day, no one has been able to answer these questions. But I wonder if Elisa's spirit still roams the Cecil Hotel, waiting for someone to uncover the truth. The case of Elisa Lam has never left my mind. Every detail seems stranger than the last. Even after the police closed the investigation, ruling her death as an accidental drowning, many questions remained unanswered. How did she get to the water tank? If the access door to the rooftop was locked and only employees had the key, did someone help her get there? After the elevator video went viral, amateur investigators began to analyze every detail of the case, and some discoveries made everything even more mysterious. First, the security camera video seemed to have been edited. The timestamp skipped several seconds, and there was a strange delay when the elevator doors finally closed. Some people suggested that the police or the hotel had cut parts of the video to hide someone who was with Elisa. But who? Another issue was the water tank lid. Officers stated that the tank was found with the lid closed. If this was true, then how could Elisa have locked herself in there? It would have been impossible for her to close the heavy lid from inside the water. Several theories emerged. Some believed Elisa was running from someone, and in her desperation, climbed to the rooftop and tried to hide inside the tank. But this didn't explain how she would have been able to open the lid, get inside, and close it afterward. Others suggested that Elisa was the victim of a crime. Perhaps a hotel employee was involved, since only they had easy access to the rooftop. But why would someone place her in a water tank and close the lid? Supernatural explanations also spread. The Cecil Hotel has a history of disturbing deaths and crimes. Some said Elisa was the victim of something haunting the hotel. The elevator video seemed to show Elisa interacting with an invisible presence. Could something have drawn her to the rooftop that night? Moreover, some strange connections were found. Days after Elisa's death, a tuberculosis outbreak occurred in the area around the hotel. The name of the test used to diagnose the disease was LAMELISA. Coincidence or something more? The case became even more enigmatic when a private investigator tried to retrace Elisa's steps inside the hotel. He discovered that hotel alarms should have gone off if someone tried to access the rooftop without permission. But that night, no alarm sounded. Then there was the issue of the autopsy. The report stated that there were no signs of trauma on Elisa's body, but some parts of the report were inconclusive. Additionally, the coroners took months to release the final results, which was unusual for drowning cases. Even years later, the mystery remains unsolved. Some believe Elisa was the victim of a crime that was covered up. Others think she had a psychotic episode and put herself in that situation. And some say something inexplicable happened at the Cecil Hotel that night. The Cecil Hotel closed for a time after the case, but reopened under a new name. Even so, its haunted reputation remains, and many believe the spirits of those who died there still roam the halls. What really happened to Elisa Lam that night? I don't know. But one thing is certain. This is one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in modern history. And perhaps we'll never have all the answers. My name is Daniel Carter, and this is the story that almost no one wants you to know. For years, the United States government denied the existence of certain experiments. They called it a conspiracy theory, the delusions of paranoid lunatics. But the truth is far worse than anyone could imagine. The MKUltra experiment was one of the darkest and cruelest programs ever conducted by the government. Between the 1950s and 1970s, the CIA tested hallucinogenic substances, psychological torture techniques, and mind control methods on American citizens. The guinea pigs were soldiers, prisoners, mentally ill patients, and even ordinary citizens, all without their knowledge or consent. The goal? To create an infallible method of mental manipulation, a form of absolute control. I discovered this story not through official documents, but because the truth came to me. My grandfather, Richard Carter, was a military psychiatrist who worked on classified projects. During my childhood, he was a reserved man, quiet, always lost in thought. When I asked about his work, he never answered. He would only look away and say, "There are things it's better not to know." But the truth found its way to the surface. When my grandfather passed away, I inherited an old locked box. Inside, I found dozens of notes, photographs, and cassette tapes. As I read them, I realized that he not only knew about MKUltra, but was actively involved in it. The accounts were disturbing. My grandfather described how patients were dosed with high amounts of LSD and other experimental drugs. They were kept in white rooms without windows where they stayed for weeks on end. Some subjects were ordered to commit violent acts, and others were subjected to intense hypnosis until they completely lost their identity. One of the cases that haunted me the most was that of a man named Henry O'Connor. He had been admitted to a psychiatric hospital in 1963 and was soon assigned to the Blackbird Project, a subdivision of MKUltra. According to my grandfather's records, Henry was subjected to extreme sensory deprivation sessions. He would spend entire days in a dark chamber, hearing voices repeating the same message, "You are not real." Over time, he began to believe it. In my grandfather's last notes about Henry, he wrote something that chilled me to the bone. O'Connor stopped responding to conventional tests. He just stares at the wall and murmurs things no one can understand. But yesterday, when I entered the room to observe him, he looked directly at me and said, "They are watching you too, Dr. Carter. They know what you've done." Henry O'Connor disappeared from the record shortly afterward. No mention of him in official files, no death certificate. It was as if he had never existed. The more I read, the more I realized that MKUltra was not just a failed experiment. It was something far worse. People disappeared, memories were erased, lives were destroyed. Even my grandfather seemed haunted by what he had witnessed. In the last days of his life, he wrote something on a loose sheet of paper, a phrase repeated several times, as if it were a warning. They never ended the experiment. At that moment, I felt a chill run through my body. If this were true, if MKUltra had never truly ended, then what else could be happening in the shadows? But the most disturbing part of this story was still to come. Inside the box, I found something that shouldn't exist. A recording. A cassette tape marked with the initials MKU and a date, 1971. I placed the tape in my grandfather's old recorder, and what I heard changed my life forever. A metallic, cold, emotionless voice began to speak. The experiment continues. They must not remember. The mind can be reprogrammed. The mind can be erased. Seconds later, a second voice entered the recording. It was a scream, a human scream, pure desperation. And then, silence. But in the background, almost imperceptible, I heard something else. A whisper, so faint that I had to rewind the tape and listen several times to be sure of what it was saying. If you found this, it's already too late. My heart almost stopped in that moment. I had to uncover the truth. But was the truth already watching me? At that moment, I felt something I had never felt before, pure terror. It wasn't the usual fear, but a deep dread, as if something invisible was watching me at that exact moment. The recording still echoed in my mind. If you found this, it's already too late. What did that mean? Did my grandfather know that someone would eventually find that tape? Or worse, did someone know that I would find it? I tried to stay calm and think rationally. I needed to know more. I went back to the documents that were in the box. Among my grandfather's notes, I found an address written by hand. It was for a psychiatric hospital in Maryland, closed in the 1980s. Next to the address, a single word was written in trembling letters: survivor. My mind immediately made the connection. Was one of the MK Ultra patients still alive? I had no other choice. The next morning, I got in my car and drove to Maryland. The old psychiatric hospital was a massive building, abandoned for decades. The place reeked of decay with broken windows and ivy covering the walls. There was an absolute silence, as if time had stopped there. My heart raced as I approached the entrance. The door was ajar, as if someone still visited that place. I entered cautiously. The smell of mold and dust filled my nostrils. The main hallway was a maze of rusted doors and old clipboards scattered on the floor. I was about to give up when I heard a sound, a breath. Frozen, I slowly turned my head. At the end of the hallway, an elderly man sat in a wheelchair, staring directly at me. His eyes were empty, as if they no longer belonged to this world. His skin was pale, and he seemed to have not moved for years. I swallowed hard and carefully approached. "Sir, are you Henry O'Connor?" He blinked slowly. After a few seconds, his mouth opened. They never stopped. His voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken in years. A chill ran down my spine. "Who never stopped?" I asked, feeling cold sweat trickle down my face. He raised his trembling hand and pointed to the wall behind me. I turned around and saw something that made my blood run cold. There were words scrawled on the wall, repeated several times, as if they had been written in a state of absolute desperation. They're still watching. They still control. MK Ultra never ended. My instincts screamed for me to leave. But before I could take a step back, Henry grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "They came for me. They'll come for you too." I pulled away and ran out of the hospital, my heart pounding. I jumped into the car and sped off without looking back. But something inside me told me I wasn't safe anymore. I arrived home, exhausted and paranoid. I closed all the curtains, locked the doors, and tried to convince myself that all of it was madness. But then, my phone vibrated. Unknown number. I hesitated before answering. "Carter." The voice was distorted, almost inhuman. "You've gone too far." The phone hung up. I stood there, staring at the device in my hands, feeling the terror consume me. They knew. They were watching me. I had awakened something that should have stayed buried. And now, I was the next one. My name is Jason, and what I'm about to share happened to my sister, Sarah, about 5 years ago. At the time, she was single and occasionally used dating apps to meet people. As the older sibling, Sarah was fiercely independent and level-headed, but also cautious. That's what made the events of this night even more disturbing. It was a typical Friday evening. Sarah mentioned she had a date at a bar just a few blocks from her house. The man, who went by the name Mike, seemed friendly on the app. When she left, None of us were worried. This was something she did occasionally, and everything seemed normal. At the bar, Sarah arrived and texted Mike to let him know she was there. While waiting, an older man approached her. He had graying hair, a disheveled appearance, and a sour smell that matched his crumpled shirt. His smile was unsettling, marked by a crooked, yellowing front tooth. "Can I buy you a drink?" he asked, sitting down beside her. Sarah politely declined, explaining she was waiting for someone. But the man lingered, pressing her into conversation. With every comment he made, Sarah grew increasingly uncomfortable until she firmly asked him to leave. Reluctantly, he got up, but instead of leaving the bar, he chose a seat in the corner where he could still watch her. Sarah sent another message to Mike, urging him to hurry. His reply came a few minutes later. "Running late. Grab a drink while you wait." Something about the tone unsettled her, but she tried to brush it off. Meanwhile, the strange man returned, sitting beside her once more. His presence felt bolder, more intrusive. "So, where's your date?" he teased, flashing that same unsettling smile. Sarah tried to cut the interaction short, but his persistence had taken on a menacing edge. She sent a final message to Mike, telling him she was leaving. As she pressed send, she noticed something chilling. The man's phone, sitting on the bar beside him, lit up with a notification, the very text she had just sent. A wave of realization washed over her, leaving her frozen. She quickly fabricated an excuse to use the restroom, but slipped out the side exit instead. The man didn't follow her immediately. Shaken, Sarah called me and our other sister, Natalie, explaining what had happened. I told her to come straight to our house. When Sarah arrived and came inside, she mentioned seeing a car she thought had followed her into the neighborhood. Nervous, we checked the windows, but the car was gone. She recounted everything, and we tried to reassure her. For a while, it seemed the nightmare was over. We all went to bed, but the relief didn't last. Lying in her room, Sarah received another text from the same number. It read, "Sorry I missed you at the bar. What's your window? I want to see you." What happened next is something we'll never forget. Still trembling from the message, Sarah called Natalie into her room and showed her the phone screen. Both froze for a moment, trying to process how the man knew where she lived. As they debated what to do, Sarah felt a strange unease settle over her. The night had grown unnaturally silent, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then they heard a faint noise coming from the window. Something slid. Sarah's partially lowered blinds began to lift slowly. For a brief moment, both froze in terror, but when a stranger's hand pushed aside the curtain, they screamed in unison. The sound echoed through the house loud enough to wake the rest of the family. I was the first to burst into Sarah's room, closely followed by our parents. The window was already open, but the man had backed away. I rushed to the window and peered out. The street was dark, but I managed to spot a silhouette running toward a parked car across the road. The figure quickly got in, started the engine, and sped off. I tried to make out the license plate, but it was too dark. Meanwhile, our father ran outside with a baseball bat, but the man was already gone. We immediately called the police, recounting everything, from the incident at the bar to what had just happened. Sarah handed over the messages and the phone number the man had been using. When the police arrived, they asked a series of questions and provided guidance. They promised to investigate the number, but cautioned us that many people use apps to mask their identity. They also recommended reinforcing our home's security and keeping all doors and windows locked at all times. The next morning, we received a call from the police department. The number used by the man had been traced, but it belonged to a messaging app that didn't require real identification. They explained that tracking the individual further would be challenging without additional information. Though the man never reappeared, the incident left a lasting impact. Sarah was paranoid for weeks, and we all felt the need to improve our home's security. Our father installed new locks and surveillance cameras around the house. A few months later, we received a final update from the police. They hadn't been able to identify the man, but they uncovered similar reports of unsettling encounters involving the same tactics, a fake profile on dating apps, followed by stalking or attempted break-ins. This wasn't an isolated case. Since then, Sarah has completely abandoned dating apps. Although she's worked hard to move past the trauma, the experience left scars. To this day, she double-checks every lock on every window before going to bed, and our family has never looked at casual encounters the same way. This story still haunts us, but it taught us to be more cautious and vigilant. We'll never know what that man wanted or how far he was willing to go, but we're grateful Sarah escaped before something worse happened. And most importantly, she was never contacted by him again. I was nervous that night, but not in the way I had hoped. After months of trying to ease back into dating, I finally scheduled dinner with a woman named Kate, whom I'd met through an app. She seemed interesting, a little older than me, but there was something about her energy that made me curious. We arranged to meet at a small casual restaurant in town. I arrived a few minutes early and waited in my car, answering messages and listening to music. She texted to say she was having trouble finding the place, so I shared my location to help her. Shortly after, I saw an old car pull into the lot. When she stepped out, I realized it was Kate. We greeted each other briefly, but something about the initial interaction felt off. She declined a polite hug and walked straight into the restaurant without much conversation. I took a deep breath, trying not to let it throw me off. Inside, things only got more uncomfortable. Kate was different from how her photos portrayed her, older and visibly worn as if life had weighed her down. I tried to make light conversation, but she responded with short, distracted sentences, her mind seemingly elsewhere. When the waiter came to take our order, she became noticeably uneasy, almost irritated. She only ordered water and declined my suggestion to share a glass of wine. Throughout dinner, the conversation stayed shallow and strained. I couldn't relax. Something about her presence felt unsettling. When the check arrived, there was no mention of splitting it. Reluctantly, I paid, and we stepped outside. She seemed hesitant to say goodbye, but I forced a smile, told her it had been a nice evening, and got into my car. Driving home, I felt a palpable relief. It was over. I arrived home, took off my coat, and began to unwind when the doorbell shattered the silence. Curious and confused, I looked out the window. There she was, Kate, standing at my door. My heart raced. How did she know where I lived? Then it hit me. I hadn't turned off the location sharing. A message buzzed on my phone. "I know you're there. Open the door." My blood ran cold. I ducked into the kitchen, keeping the lights off, hoping she'd leave. More messages followed. "You're not going to run from me like the others." The situation escalated when I heard the sound of shattering glass. She had broken one of my side windows. Fear gripped me as I bolted to my bedroom, locking the door and calling the police. While I explained the situation, I heard heavy footsteps approaching my room. "You shouldn't have ignored me," she shouted, pounding on the door. The operator instructed me to find something to defend myself with and ensure the door was secure. The wait for the police felt like an eternity, and the relentless banging on the door only amplified my panic. I clutched a heavy lamp, ready to defend myself if necessary, praying for the nightmare to end. Finally, the sound of sirens pierced the air. Relief washed over me as Kate screamed in frustration, and the pounding stopped. There was a moment of eerie silence before I heard the front door burst open. The police found her in the living room, clutching one of my kitchen knives. She was quickly subdued, handcuffed, and escorted out. I shakily explained everything to the officers, from the unsettling dinner to her breaking into my home. That night changed everything. I couldn't shake the image of her standing at my door or the sound of her voice behind the bedroom door. It's a night I'll never forget, one that left me questioning my trust in people and my safety in my own home. The day after the incident, the feeling of vulnerability clung to me like a shadow. Every sound seemed suspicious, every flicker of movement made me look twice. Even with the police stepping in and removing Pamela, or rather Kate, from the situation, the unease remained. I spent the morning reinforcing the locks and windows of my apartment, but it didn't feel like enough to shake off the lingering fear. Every corner of my home seemed tainted by her presence. A few hours later, the police contacted me. They had taken Pamela into custody and were beginning to piece together her true identity. Her real name, background, and past behavior came to light. I learned that Pamela had a troubling history of stalking and obsessive behavior. A clear pattern emerged. She used dating apps to insinuate herself into the lives of her victims, only to obsessively pursue them afterward. It was like something out of a horror film, except it was terrifyingly real. The police also found a journal in her home, filled with detailed notes about me, my routines, habits, and even trivial things she had observed. There were entries noting the exact times I usually turned off my lights at night. Hearing that made my blood run cold. Pamela had been watching me from afar long before our first date. When the trial came, I was called to testify. Facing her again was unnerving but also revealing. She appeared almost remorseful in that setting, yet her eyes carried the same unsettling glint that had made me uneasy from the beginning. The prosecution laid out details of other victims, illustrating how her actions weren't an isolated lapse but part of a deeply ingrained pattern of behavior. The sentence was clear. Pamela was convicted and sentenced to prison with mandatory psychiatric treatment. Knowing she was behind bars brought some relief, but the emotional toll of the experience was something only time could heal. Shortly after the trial, I moved to a new apartment in another city, hoping for a fresh start. While I never fully regained my sense of security, I slowly began to rebuild my peace of mind. Today I approach online dating with much greater caution. That night taught me that even the simplest encounters can carry unforeseen risks, and trusting your instincts is more important than ever. Pamela remains a stark reminder of how unpredictable the world can be, but also of the resilience it takes to overcome those moments and move forward. My name is Christopher, and this story took place 2 years ago, during a time when I was trying to rebuild my life after a difficult breakup. Back then, I decided to give dating apps a shot, knowing full well they didn't always deliver what they promised. That's how I met Amelia. She seemed friendly, had a captivating smile in her photos, and our conversations flowed well enough for me to feel comfortable inviting her over for dinner. A bold move, perhaps, but I thought a relaxed home setting would be better than a restaurant. The plan was simple. I'd cook penne alla vodka with garlic bread and open a bottle of wine. It was my go-to dish for making an impression, and truthfully, I was a bit nervous. It had been a while since my last date, and Amelia was the first person in a long time to genuinely seem interested. She arrived promptly at 6:30 p.m. My first impression was positive, though she seemed a bit more reserved than I had expected. She wore a simple dress and had a shy smile as she stepped through my front door. I did my best to make her feel comfortable, showing her the kitchen and suggesting she sit at the dining table while I finished preparing dinner. At first, our conversation was hesitant. I asked questions, tried to make her laugh with a few stories, but Amelia responded with short sentences and occasionally seemed distracted. Still, I pressed on. I offered her some wine, but she declined, asking for water instead. Then, nervously, she suggested we light a candle to make the atmosphere more special. I found the request a little odd, but went along with it, fetching a candle from the pantry. When I returned and lit the candle, I noticed something felt off. Amelia was seated again, but she seemed slightly unsettled, as if she had moved quickly moments before. I asked if everything was okay, and she smiled, saying she had just gone to the sink to wash her hands. I thought it was strange since I hadn't heard the faucet, but I brushed it off. Nerves get to everyone on a first date. Dinner was served, and Amelia began to relax. She listened attentively as I talked about my passion for cooking and my work. But as I raised my wine glass to make a toast, something caught my eye. Tiny granules floating in the liquid. It looked like powder. My mind raced, but I kept my composure. Feigning a sip, I set the glass down and didn't touch it again. After dinner, she excused herself to use the bathroom. As soon as she left the table, I took the opportunity to inspect the wine more closely. The smell seemed normal, but there was no denying the odd substance floating in it. My heart started pounding. Could she have put something in my drink? The thought seemed absurd, but my instincts told me otherwise. Amelia stayed in the bathroom for what felt like an eternity. When she returned, she said she needed to leave because her dog wasn't feeling well. I didn't question her, grateful to see the evening come to an end. I thanked her for coming and walked her to the door. She left, and I exhaled deeply, relieved but unsettled. Something about the night hadn't felt right, and my intuition was on high alert. Later that evening, as I sat in my bedroom trying to relax, I heard a noise from the kitchen. It sounded like something falling, a cup or a dish hitting the floor. I froze, my mind racing. I distinctly remembered locking every door and window after Amelia had left. Who could be in the kitchen? Grabbing my phone for light, I cautiously made my way toward the sound. As I stepped into the kitchen, my eyes scanned for any sign of movement. Everything seemed in place, until I noticed one of the back windows slightly ajar. My sense of security crumbled, and I realized then that the night was far from over. The open window felt like a punch to the gut. I was certain I'd closed it after Amelia left. The idea of someone breaking into my home sent my heart racing, and suddenly every sound was deafening. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves and think rationally. Grabbing a knife from the block on the counter, I kept my phone steady in the other hand. I took a cautious step back, convincing myself I might be overreacting. Maybe I had left the window unlocked without realizing it. But then a darker thought crossed my mind. What if Amelia had deliberately left the window unlatched before she left? It seemed absurd, but after seeing the suspicious substance in my wine, I couldn't rule anything out. As I slowly moved to check the other doors and windows, I heard a sound from the living room, a faint creak, like the floorboards shifting under weight. I froze, holding my breath, trying to pinpoint the direction of the noise. Then I saw it, a shadow shifting in the dim light. My blood ran cold. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling but loud enough to echo through the house. No response. Instead, a chill ran down my spine as the shadow moved again, closer to the hallway leading to my bedroom. I swallowed hard, taking silent steps in the opposite direction, trying to maintain as much distance as possible. I needed to call the police, but I'd have to get to my bedroom where the signal was stronger. As I crept down the hallway, a whisper cut through the silence. It was faint but unmistakable, and chilling. "Christopher." The voice was soft but carried a tone that sent shivers through me. At that moment, I knew. This wasn't a random break-in. It was personal. Amelia. It had to be her. I reached my bedroom and shut the door, locking it quickly. My heart pounded as I dialed 911, explaining the situation in hurried whispers. I told the operator someone was in my home, possibly armed. They assured me officers were on their way. While I waited, I heard footsteps outside the bedroom door. They stopped directly in front of it. Then the doorknob turned slowly but couldn't open. "Open the door, Chris," Amelia's voice whispered through the door. "I just want to talk." My eyes darted to the knife in my hand as every instinct screamed at me not to respond. "Go away, Amelia," I yelled, trying to sound braver than I felt. "The police are on their way." There was a heavy silence on the other side of the door. Then, the sound of something being dragged across the floor began. My heart felt like it might burst as I imagined what she might be doing. Frozen in place, I clung to the knife, the only thing grounding me in that moment of pure terror. Minutes later, I heard the distant sound of sirens. Relief surged through me. Amelia must have heard them too, because the dragging stopped and her footsteps retreated. Then came the sound of breaking glass. I rushed to the window and saw her fleeing through the backyard, disappearing into the darkness. Moments later, flashing blue and red lights filled the street as the police arrived. I unlocked the bedroom door and ran to meet the officers. I explained everything, and they searched the house. They found the back window broken and evidence that she had returned the knife to the kitchen before leaving. Thankfully, no one was hurt, but the experience was harrowing. A search was initiated, and Amelia was found later that night hiding in a nearby park, still wearing the same outfit from dinner. Amelia was arrested and charged with trespassing and attempted assault. I later learned she had a criminal history of obsessive and dangerous behavior with other men. I wasn't her first victim, and if not for quick action, I might not have been her last. After that night, I took drastic measures to secure my home. I installed new locks, reinforced my windows, and added security cameras. Still, the memory of Amelia calling my name through the door, the tension in her voice, and the sheer terror of being trapped in my own home lingered long after. I haven't trusted easily since. That night taught me to be cautious, to listen to my instincts, and to never let my guard down again. I can only hope I never encounter someone like her again.